So now, please welcome the official, non-official, non-sponsor of the Savannah Bananas, but a big fan. Please welcome John Fletcher.
Well, welcome to the inaugural podcast of 15 on Fridays with Fletch. I'm John Fletcher, the public relations consultant, and I'm indirectly the number one tennis player in the world because I once beat a guy who beat a guy who beat a guy who beat Jimmy Connors, who was number one in the world. So my guest is internationally acclaimed acoustics authority Steve Durr from Nashville. Steve and I met when we first prepared as a doubles team at the City Tennis Invitational in Nashville almost 30 years ago. He's one heck of a tennis player, also technically, indirectly, the number one tennis player in the world. And he owns and operates Steve Durr Design in Nashville. Steve's worked with such artists as Lenny Kravitz, Willie Nelson, Alabama, and Kansas, and he's built studios for Disney and audio systems for NASCAR. My favorite project is how he installed a new sound system and served as technical director for the Indy 500 for 10 years. Steve, you describe audio as an emotional experience. Share with me what you mean by that.
Well, essentially, everything that happens in your auditory senses is an emotional experience. If my girlfriend tells me she loves me, that's one. But if she cocks a shotgun behind me, that's a total emotional experience, but it's a completely different one. So what I'm trying to do is make loudspeakers disappear. So nobody goes to a concert or a church or anywhere to hear a set of loudspeakers. They go to have an emotional connection with the artist or with the minister or with the choir or in some cases, the announcer at the racetrack.
Well, and we'll have another talk another day about the funny thing that you did with that church in Oklahoma City to help fix the sound. That is a fun story for later. So tell us about your studio projects for Lenny Kravitz and Disney.
Well, both of those guys are totally unique. Lenny had a home in Manhattan next to a brownstone, and essentially the lady that lived next door was of Asian descent, and we went over to her house, and you could hear your heartbeat. It was so quiet in there. And of course, Lenny plays everything on 20. And so I had a discussion with him about maybe we should find another space, and that didn't work. And so we literally had to go in and build a building inside of a building on springs and everything else to keep the noise out of her apartment. And quite honestly, I lost a lot of sleep over it. Not that much because it's not an emergency room, but at the same time, it was very stressful to do, and it worked fine.
Well, one of the great memories I do have is when you invited my son Drew and me to go to Bristol, Tennessee for the NASCAR race. And you had us down there. You were doing the gentleman start your engine sound. And then we were up there in the owner's suite for the whole race. So tell, one of the things that happened there, you knew the name of every small person. I mean, everybody knows the name of the owner of the track, but you knew the name of every small person. Tell us why that's important.
My father taught me a long time ago that nobody remembers what you say, but they always remember how you make them feel. And so I've always celebrated everybody's life. We all got our stuff that we should do and shouldn't do. We all have our issues, but everybody's got a story to tell. And most of the time, if you give them a chance or put a smile on your face, they'll share things with you and you learn a great deal.
Tell us about you. You worked with 9 different NASCAR tracks over the years, plus Indy and some football stadiums. So tell us about that. Those are some pretty unique venues.
They were, and what happened there was, I've been a recording engineer. I've made a lot of records, worked in a lot of studios, and had designed a lot of recording studios. In about 1990, when Pro Tools and the computer world came out, essentially nobody needed a studio anymore. They could literally make records on their kitchen table, and they didn't need musicians. That's the whole story, is the way it went. And so, fortunately, because I had done a lot of live sound with Billy Joel and a lot of famous artists growing up, um, that I was able to take that experience and translate that into race cars and things that I truly loved. And so I was able to get out of the studio business long enough and to pick back up where I am now, which is basically everybody wants a studio that they can put the whole band in and make a record just like they did. Well, I'm sort of uniquely qualified for that as a studio designer. I don't really have an extensive background, and I firmly believe that without almost an encyclopedic knowledge of the history of how we got here, you're not going to be able to do what you do. And Right now, most people get all of their information off a black screen, whether it's a phone or whether it's a computer face. And there's not a lot of background of how did we get to this point with acoustics? How did we get to this point with sound systems and that sort of thing? And a simple story was we did the Chiefs Stadium, and I had a list of equipment a magazine wanted to write an article about, and I sent it to him, and he goes, "Well, I only got one page." And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, it's not even full of equipment." I said, "Yeah, that's true." "Well, you can't do it with that." I said, "Well, you need to come listen to it." I didn't put anything in there that doesn't need to be there. So it really sounded incredible for a long time.
Well, I remember that when I was living in Waco before coming up here, that we were going to build a home theater, and I called you and you gave me the specs to use. And when I was buying the materials, the guy said, "How do you know to get these things? People don't know to get these things." And I said, "I've got a guy." And so they were very impressed. Well, tell
Uh,
us about, I mean, the Indy 500 is as prestigious a venue as you can get. So what
yeah.
intrigued you about it? And I mean, I read a 16-page article about how complex it was. Tell us about it.
Well, in all sincerity, it's a childhood dream to work there. And in the 60s, I was a really big Indy fan. I knew I was never going to be a race car driver, but I was doing audio. Well, it was a very unique racetrack. Before there was any cameras and video screens, there was a gentleman named Tom Carnegie, and he had the most magical voice. And he would be able to describe to the fans on the front stretch what was going on in the back stretch because you couldn't see it in a way like all eyes on turn 4. And it just gives me chills talking about it now. He had the most incredibly distinguished voice. I was very fortunate to work with him. What happened was they put a whole new sound system in there that was based on, rather than dialogue, it was based on music. And so when Carnegie talked, it sounded like this, and you couldn't understand what they were saying. And the fans went crazy. They got 15, 20,000 complaints a race. And so a friend of mine who was working there said, "Man, I need some help. Can you help me figure it out?" And I was fortunate enough to figure it out. And my childhood dream came true. And that's exactly how it happened.
Well, the article talks about that there were 7 different kinds of construction at that venue. From some of the areas were wood benches, some were
Sure,
grandstand metal, some were concrete. Tell us
sure.
how you had to work through all that. I mean, that's like a nightmare, isn't it?
Not really. Essentially, what happens is that the front stretch has bleachers all the way up on one side, and then a building, the pagoda, and all the other bleachers. So this front stretch was more of inside of a building, and so the adjustments that I made, and the speakers that I'd made in that space in the front stretch, where there were buildings on both sides, was completely unique compared to the other rest of the racetrack, which had no buildings. So essentially, other than the front stretch, it was outside. So all I had to know was the same thing I know when I go and work in a cathedral or a church. If you don't put sound where the reflections are, then obviously you don't have a reverberant field. If you can aim the speakers where the people are sitting and not on the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, it doesn't matter how hard the surfaces are in the church or any other space for that. I was very fortunate to be able to do that at the Library of Congress. Essentially, the voice dialogue travels exactly like a flashlight. And ironically, the speakers were aimed at the seating area on the racetrack in the front stretch, and we couldn't hear anything at all. And so we went up on the roof, we could hear just fine. And what was happening is the heat from the racetrack was pushing the sound waves up. And so we aimed the speakers at the soundtrack at the racetrack, and now they've been up right into the stand. There was a lot of stuff like that.
Well, so tell us more about the Library of Congress. I mean, that's got to be one more of those bucket list projects.
It was pretty crazy. Uh, yeah, we designed all the acoustics and sound for the Library of Congress Conservatory of Film and Music. And it was an incredibly 5-year long project, which was an incredible learning experience. And it was also a real honor to be there.
Well, I remember that I brought you into Waco. There was a special project, and it was a musical venue indoors, a performance hall. And you were talking to the guy, and he had this big budget to spend, and you said, "You don't need to spend all this money. If you would we could rework your speakers, and we could recondition your amplifiers, and you could get out for like $25,000 or $30,000. But he had a big budget, and he said, "Well, if I don't spend all this, I won't get a big budget next year." And so you were showing him what he could do for 25,000 instead of 200,000.
Well, 99%, I'd say 95% of the issues with any sound system, it's in a church, in a stadium, I don't care where it is, it's just like Eric Clapton can take a guitar from Sears and make everybody in the room cry because he understands how to play it. And I don't play instruments, I don't play drums, I don't play guitar. And so my emotional connection and my talent is understanding how to interface those speakers into a room. That's what I've spent my whole life doing. And so in his case, he had the right stuff. It just somebody didn't understand how to tune it or tweak it or balance it in that room. Unfortunately, a wealth of features breeds a poverty of skills, and that's gotten to be just ridiculous in the last few years.
Well, and so and I guess one of your stories that I love the most was you had a very unique experience with Paul McCartney in Las Vegas.
No,
When
it
you
was in
built that. Tell us
Indianapolis.
about
It was in Indianapolis.
Indianapolis. Tell us about
Yeah.
that.
Well, there was a building in Indianapolis that was getting constant complaints about the audio, and it was written up, the sound for concerts, and it was written up in the newspaper and all this other stuff. And so I went down there and looked at it and listened to a couple of things and went to a couple of concerts. And sure enough, the whole room loaded up with all these bass frequencies. And so I went to the guy, who was a really sweetheart guy, and said, "Look, I can fix it. It's going to cost you a whole lot more for me to fix it than it is for then it's going to cost you to actually fix it. It's going to cost you more for me. I'm going to be the most expensive part of the project, and you don't have to pay me if it doesn't work because it's so crazy. I don't think you can possibly believe how simple it is." Well, I figured out what was happening. They were pushing the bleachers up against the back when they had a concert, and like some kind of rock concert, and the energy was going through the slots in the seats and bouncing off the concrete wall behind it, coming back out. So I was able to put some material up on the back of the bleachers and stop it. Well, the first concert was Paul McCartney and Wings. And so they wouldn't let anybody in. Of course, it was real serious. It was dead dark. I couldn't see a soul. There was no lights on stage. This band came out and they played this, like, just funky kind of rhythm thing. And I was way up in the top of the stadium. I'm the only person in there except for security. It sounded incredible. And I screamed out, "Wow, that's unbelievable." And I started cheering and applauding. McCartney leans in the microphone and goes, "I love an audience of one." It was really quite funny. I never talked to him. I never said a word. I've heard he's a really wonderful person, but it was such a shock at how good the concert was. And that night it was really unbelievable. And the papers went on and on about the magic that happened. The magic was 45 pieces of pegboard, but it
Wow.
worked.
Well, we're winding down, Steve.
Sure.
You had three artists that you said had the most pure voices. One of them was Paul McCartney,
Yeah.
and you told me that. Tell us who the other two were.
Well, ironically, when I started this process, you didn't have a choice. So Al Green in early records were just beyond belief. His voice is just incredible. And I still marvel at the stuff that they did at Columbia with Frank Sinatra and those sort of things. It's not so much their voice, because there's a lot of people now that have great voices, and the technology is just ruining it. And the mentality is ruining it.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you what, we're running out of time right now. I will have you back again. Thanks to my friend Steve Durr from Nashville. Awesome tennis player and incredible friend. I've got to tell you, we had this one match we played in, is this Music City Tennis Invitational. We're playing these other guys, and we were all playing well. And if you remember, Steve, we were going out and we were high-fiving even our opponents between points because it was such a fun match. So,
It's not my job. I do it for fun.
I know it. Well, you just enjoy the experience. And that's the same. And once again, it's the emotional connection.
Absolutely.
Disney always said emotions trump everything, and you're living proof of that. You've been hearing 15 on Fridays with Fletch. This is my inaugural event right here with Steve Durr from Nashville, Steven Durr Designs. You will be hearing from him again because he is one of my very favorite people on the planet. Thanks a lot for joining us. We look forward to you joining us for 15 more minutes next time.